The smoke from my own house was still threaded through my hair when she walked into my courtroom like she was touring a show home. Chin high, smile lacquered in self-importance. The scent of burnt wood, melted wiring, and memory lingered on me like a second robe, and she had the gall to strut as if the bench belonged to her. I tightened my grip on the gavel and watched Bryn Ashworth Sterling take a seat as though she were doing the room a favor. The audacity would have been entertaining if my life weren't sitting in a heap of ash 3 miles away. She'd made her first mistake days earlier. Today, she made the second. She walked into the one place where I'm strongest. 6 months before my kitchen turned to cinders, I was simply Judge Miriam Blackwood, respected on the docket, empty at home. Cancer had taken Harold with a cruelty that makes you understand the word devour. We'd built a life over 28 years with modest ambitions and stubborn tenderness, a 1940s craftsman in Pinewood Estates, the kind of street where blue-collar families taught kids to ride bikes in cul-de-sacs and retired teachers coaxed miracles out of flower beds. Then the money came. Modest ranches vanished under the jaws of backhoes. In their place, elevated McMansions rose, 3-car garages attached to houses that looked like they were designed by a committee and focus grouped into sterility. Property taxes ballooned. The old-timers kept their heads down until they were priced out or worn down. The new guard called it progress. Most of us learned to call it exhausting. And then there was her, the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. Bryn Ashworth Sterling blended the worst parts of a venture capitalist and a pageant coach. 45, silver Tesla, athleisure that cost more than mortgages, a smoothie glued to her hand like a prop. She didn't smile with her eyes. She smiled with her agenda. The moment she arrived, she made it clear she would elevate Pinewood to its full potential. Translation: make the place look like a brochure by squeezing out anyone who wasn't a brochure. The morning we met, I was installing the last panel of Harold's memorial fence, our final project together. A 6-foot privacy barrier. We planned the way some people plan vacations, measuring morning light, imagining quiet coffee, practicing the discipline of looking forward when your present feels like a bruise. His prize roses perfumed the air, 15 years of care anchored in soil that still remembered his hands. I threaded a screw through wood and grief, and heard the crunch of moneyed boots behind me. You must be the widow. Not a hello. Not a condolence. A label pinned to my chest. Judge Blackwood. I said, calmly, the way you say your name when you're setting a boundary. Right. The judge, she replied like judge was a rash you could catch. I'm Bryn, HOA president. We have a problem. She produced a pink tape measure with the flair of a magician ready to saw the assistant in half. The metallic snap cut the morning open. She measured the fence as if she were timing a heartbeat, her mouth pursed tight. 6 feet, 2 inches. Our regulations clearly state a 6-foot maximum. That's a $500 violation and immediate removal. Show me that regulation, I said. Her manicure was sharp enough to click like high heels against paper as she shuffled through a leather portfolio. She found nothing because nothing existed. My fence was 6 feet. I'd hired a surveyor. I'd done it by the book. Grief makes you careful. I was not in the mood to make reparable mistakes. She cleared her throat and painted her face with professional offense. We'll see about that, Judge. That venom wasn't about property standards. It was about me. Or more accurately, about a history she'd rather I had forgotten. That evening, under the soft hum of Harold's old desk lamp, I pulled court records. Sterling Premium Builders, her husband's outfit, had stood in front of my bench 3 years earlier. They'd tried to peel $30,000 off an 80-year-old veteran for emergency roof repairs, on a roof that didn't need a single nail. I'd ruled. Hard. Referred the case for fraud. Recommended investigation. So the tape measure? Not about inches. About payback. Here's the problem with picking a fight with someone like me. I spend my life inside rules. I memorize their edges and their weaknesses. I don't confuse volume with victory. I don't make threats. I make records. I ran my palm along the new wood, rough and steady. We picked cedar because it weathers honestly. A fence around a sanctuary not a fortress against a neighborhood. The smell of sawdust mixed with roses and loss. The panels didn't block the world so much as cured it a space herald, and I imagined where we could watch sunrises without feeling observed. It wasn't just lumber, it was promise. Bryn had no idea what she just stepped into. The HOA presidency gave her a title. Mine came with 20 years of sending people to prison without blinking. She measured my fence and mismeasured her opponent. Within days, her paper war began. Thick envelopes with too much weight to be neighborly dropped into my mailbox like accusations. The first letter scolded my memorial stone for disrupting uniform landscape aesthetics. The second claimed my black mailbox, installed during the Reagan era, was suddenly a crisis of visual discord. The third accused my small bird feeder of creating nuisance conditions as if cardinals were a gang. Fines range from the petty to the insulting. Threats of liens and further action shimmered on expensive stationery. If fear is the goal, volume is the tactic. But fear and I were no longer on speaking terms. Cancer kills that conversation. I poured bourbon into Harold's glass, opened a legal pad, and went to work. Colorado's HOA statutes aren't poetry, but when you've lived through slumlords and bad actors, you learn to love dull language that protects fragile lives. Reasonable fines, adopted bylaws, notice and hearing, due process. I read Bryn's letters like a surgeon reads scans. Holes, artifacts, contradictions. They cited regulations that didn't exist. They skipped required hearing procedures. They leaned on policy as if the word could do the work of law. It was intimidation masquerading as governance. I photographed everything front yard, backyard, fence lines, mailbox, roses. I cataloged dates, envelopes, stamps. The musty smell of Harold's law books filled his office as if his quiet instruction had never left. Evidence preservation had always been my discipline. Now it was my weapon. Then came a new low. While I was downtown sentencing a man who broke his wife's jaw, my security cameras captured Bryn striding through my backyard under the fiction of emergency inspection. No notice, no authority, pink tape measure brandished like a badge, her face pressed to the kitchen window to peer at Harold's coffee mug, the one I still couldn't bring myself to wash. She left the back gate open on purpose, the camera catching the deliberate tug and test, the satisfied glance over her shoulder. That evening, the house was quiet in a way that hurt. Too quiet. Gavel. I called and the name echoed. He's 14, striped and dignified, rescued from a courthouse parking lot during a thunderstorm 3 years ago. He kept Harold company through chemo, purring into pain the way only animals know how. He didn't come when I called. He always came. Panic is a strange heat. It makes the world too bright. I searched alleys until my voice cracked, knocked on doors until my knuckles ached. Neighbors joined with flashlights. Walt Henderson, who'd lived here since 1965, put his pipe down and organized a search like it was a barn raising. We walked and called until the night folded in on itself. The call from the animal hospital came late the next day. Ribs fractured, dehydrated, terrified, injuries consistent with being chased by machinery, the vet said, gently. Leaf blowers, lawn equipment, the kind of noise that shreds prey, instincts. I watched the footage and felt a clean, precise rage. 1 hour after Bryn's illegal trespass, her landscaping crew had swarmed through the open gate with industrial blowers, herding panic down my side yard and into the street. 2 blocks away, Gavel fell into a storm drain and didn't move again until a stranger scooped him out. People call animal cruelty a misdemeanor because they've never heard a creature cry for someone who's not coming. That's where chapter 1 could end if life cared about neat breaks. It doesn't. Walt showed up that evening with news heavy as wet wool. The Rodriguez family had been bullied into removing a garden statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe. A single mom had been fined for chalk drawings on her own driveway. Elderly neighbors had watched their property values become weapons. The pattern clicked into place. This wasn't oversight. It was targeting. Bryn thought she'd found a widow she could punish into silence. What she found was a judge who'd spent 2 decades watching predators learn the same lesson. You can weaponize rules or you can be buried by them. I filed criminal complaints for unlawful entry and animal cruelty. I called a journalist who knows what to do with truth. And then I sat in Harold's chair, surrounded by roses and record-keeping, and felt the shape of the fight settle into my bones. She measured my fence. I measured her operation. Grief left me hollow. Paper made me dangerous. While Gavel mended under a tent of oxygen and soft towels, I turned my house into a command center. The letters didn't slow, they multiplied. Certified mail, registered mail, final notice on violations that weren't violations. The envelopes smelled like perfume and toner and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. I didn't argue. I archived. There's an art to documenting someone who believes rules are mirrors, useful only when they reflect what she wants. I lined my dining table with binders and labeled everything by date, sender, topic, and statute. I took photographs from the same positions at the same times of day, each image metadata stamped and stored twice. I printed the governing documents that actually mattered, the declaration, bylaws, and whatever passed for a rules policy in Pinewood. I highlighted every place the HOA owed me due process, then compared each requirement to Bryn's theater. State law requires a written schedule of fines. The HOA had none. State law requires notice and an opportunity to be heard. Bryn skipped the hearing and jumped straight to consequences. State law requires rules to be adopted properly. Her favorite citations trace back to nothing, ghost chapters in a book she never wrote. Every letter she mailed made my case better. I tested the management structure, too. Some HOAs hide behind a third-party company. Pinewood didn't. Bryn was the president, the compliance committee, and the enforcer wrapped in a yoga jacket and an unearned sense of urgency. When I emailed for records, she replied with condescension dressed up as policy, informing me that board materials were confidential and that executive session covered anything a resident might find inconvenient. I sent a certified request anyway, quoting the statute that requires associations to provide records to owners within a reasonable period. I gave her 10 business days and asked for 5 years of meeting minutes, adopted rules, and the fine ledger with names redacted. She responded with a form letter so vague it could have been printed for any problem and every person. I added it to a new binder labeled stonewalling. I walked the neighborhood at dawn with my phone, not as a tattletale, but as an investigator who knew that patterns beat opinions. I made a catalog, door colors outside the approved pallet on 3 homes with board member friends inside, a basketball hoop permanently staked in a driveway 2 blocks over, holiday lights still up in June, a 4-foot yard sign with a political slogan that wasn't on any allowed list. Meanwhile, the fines landing on minority and elderly residents were for bird feeders, garden stones, chalk drawings, and lawn heights that turned out to be compliant after all. Selective enforcement isn't an accident. It's a strategy with a soft voice and a hard agenda. Neighbors started bringing their stories to my porch. Walt dropped a grocery bag full of notices, the edges curled and brittle for months of handling. A nurse who worked nights whispered her fear of coming home to a tow truck hauling her car for overnight parking. A retired teacher handed me a folder labeled with the dates Bryn had inspected her backyard while she was at church. Every story had the same seam running through it. The people being targeted looked like Pinewood used to look, not like the brochure Bryn was trying to sell. I filed complaints where they would sting. The Colorado Division of Real Estate doesn't referee every neighborhood fight, but it does license community association managers and tracks HOA patterns. I sent them a packet that showed a rule book written in pencil, enforcement without procedure, and fines levied like taxes without representation. I copied the Attorney General's office on the discrimination patterns and made it clear that people were being driven from their homes under color of authority. I sent the HOA a spoliation notice, a polite, formal way of saying, don't even think about destroying records. Then I went to the board meeting. If you've never watched an HOA power trip in the wild, it's a study in fake order. Folding tables, water bottles lined up like soldiers, a timer wielded as if the First Amendment ends at 3 minutes. Bryn sat in the center, posture flawless, eyes scanning the room like a TSA agent who also sells real estate on the side. She announced rules as if she'd been elected to queen, not to service. The agenda devoted 2 minutes to owner concerns and 40 to landscape uniformity. I introduced myself for the benefit of any neighbor who hadn't yet learned my name through rumor. She looked down at her timer, thumb hovering. I spoke anyway. I was steady. No theatrics. I asked a short set of questions anyone in the room could follow. Where is the adopted fine schedule? Where are the hearing procedures? Where in the bylaws is the authority for emergency inspections without notice? What vote adopted the supposed 6-foot fence rule? When can owners inspect records? She smiled the way people do when they're deciding whether to insult you or insult your intelligence. Your time is up. Mine wasn't. The room had changed. People who came to watch were now leaning forward. Walt coughed pointedly into his hand. A mother in scrubs lifted her phone. A man in a veteran's cap crossed his arms in a way that said he'd waited his whole life for someone to ask these questions out loud. Bryn banged a gavel like she'd earned it and declared the board was entering executive session. She cited legal matters and personnel, despite the fact that we don't have personnel, and the only legal matter in the room was the one she was manufacturing. When leaders hide, communities talk. In the parking lot, people formed a half circle around me like we were building a fire with kindling made of courage. They told me what it had cost them to comply. They told me who had cried and who had moved and who had simply grown quiet. A soft-spoken man pressed a stack of printouts into my hand. Screenshots of posts in the neighborhood social group where Bryn and her inner circle mocked eyesores and planned compliance drives on the streets that were old Pinewood and brown Pinewood and fixing Pinewood. He murmured, for what it's worth, and melted into the night. I sent the screenshots to Sarah Morgan, the journalist I'd called after Gavel's injuries. She didn't waste time. She asked for source permission. She cross-checked the usernames against homeowners. She knocked on doors and listened with empathy that made people brave. She told me, give me 48 hours, in a voice that sounded like a promise. Bryn sensed the shift and doubled down. The next day, I received another violation package, this one for refusal to comply with community standards and accusations so broad it could catch sunlight. The fines were larger now, the tone more clipped. She included a final demand that threatened a lien and foreclosure over a bird feeder and a memorial stone. There's a threshold where arrogance tips into error. She stepped over it when she denied my records request formally, citing a policy that had never been adopted anywhere. I mailed my second certified letter, the kind with green cards that make even the bold blink. I gave her a deadline and included a line she couldn't miss. Failure to comply will result in immediate injunctive relief and a petition for attorney's fees. I wasn't bluffing. Judges rarely do. The first brave neighbor broke ranks that same afternoon. A white envelope slid under my door, so, quietly, I might have missed it if Gavel hadn't flicked an ear from his patch of sun. No return address. Inside, a clean stack of papers. Bank ledgers, expense authorizations, and a one-page board resolution adopting an emergency inspection policy dated last week, hours after I'd asked for the rule's origin. The ledger lines were worse. Money labeled safety consulting, landscape emergency, and community enhancement flowed to a shell company with a sterling P.O. box. The amounts weren't small. Even without a calculator, I felt the weight of 6 figures. In the margin, a post-it in neat, nervous handwriting. You didn't get this from me. I scanned, copied, and sealed the originals in plastic. I checked the metadata on the resolution and found what I expected. Created after my request, backdated to cover conduct that had already happened. In the law, we call that consciousness of guilt. In plain English, it's called lying on paper. Sarah's piece aired that night, residents on camera, with faces visible, letters in their hands, time-stamped footage of a back gate left open, and a terrified old cat running full speed into nothing. My phone lit up with messages from people who'd been quiet and were done being quiet. Community support flooded in from towns I'd never heard of. The comments were ruthless where they needed to be and compassionate where it mattered. Bryn's response was what tipped everything from petty tyranny into something a prosecutor would salivate over. She didn't retreat. She escalated. And the next document she would send made it clear she wasn't just after my garden or my fence. She was coming for my robe. The envelope arrived with the kind of official weight that makes coffee taste like ash. Colorado Judicial Discipline Commission across the top, embossed and self-serious. I sat at Harold's kitchen table, now my war desk, and opened it with the same care I'd used to handle evidence in chambers. Bryn had filed a complaint alleging I was weaponizing judicial authority to intimidate law-abiding homeowners. It read like fiction written by someone who thought legal words were just shiny marbles. The supporting materials were worse because they were clever. Doctored photographs that turned my memorial garden into a junkyard. Witness statements from her interior designer and her trainer claiming I'd threatened them, despite timestamps that put me on the bench hearing a DUI plea at the exact moment I supposedly hissed menacing things about pergolas. She built a narrative for people who wanted to believe it. A rogue judge bullying a patriotic HOA that only wanted order. She didn't stop at the commission. She leaked it. Political blogs that had hated my environmental rulings for years snapped the bait like it was free steak. Liberal judge terrorizes HOA. One screamed. An article illustrated with a photo of my front door and a fence I could have measured with my eyes closed. Comment sections erupted with people who couldn't spell jurisprudence, but somehow knew exactly how to fix the judiciary. They demanded my impeachment, my disbarment, my head on a pike at the cul-de-sac entrance. The rules of my profession are simple and heavy. I don't litigate in public. I don't clap back. I don't swing. I answer ethics inquiries with facts and patience, and the kind of calm that feels like swallowing glass when someone drags your name across the internet. For 72 hours, I lived in a hurricane I refused to dignify. My inbox filled with death threats written by men who confuse patriotism with spelling errors. My voicemail collected sermons about activist judges. My court clerk fielded reporters like a goalie in a penalty shootout. I kept my hands still and my mouth closed and my records immaculate. In that silence, you learn something about yourself, whether your backbone is decoration or infrastructure. In the background, the truth went to work. Gavel was home, stitches precise, breath steadying. He slept on my lap like an old metronome, keeping time for my anger. Every purr sanded the edges of my fury to something useful. I drafted criminal complaints with the unhurried, lethal clarity Harold and I used to call surgical. Unlawful entry with intent to intimidate, same penalties as burglary if you know where to look. Animal cruelty. Conspiracy if more than one person is involved. Each charge a brick. Each brick another weight Bryn would have to carry. Sarah Morgan's story aired a second time with news sources, and the narrative began to tilt. Faces, names, patterns, selective enforcement against elderly and minority residents juxtaposed with board member violations that sat untouched like lawn ornaments. The phone started ringing with calls that didn't threaten, they offered help. A civil rights nonprofit. 2 law firms that had taken on corrupt associations before. A state investigator who asked very politely to see everything I had. Bryn sensed a shift and pressed harder. She mailed a final demand, threatening a lien and foreclosure over a bird feeder and a memorial stone. She denied my second records request by citing a policy that did not exist in reality or any universe where words retain meaning. It was bluster dressed up as bureaucracy. I certified another letter that said what needed saying, comply, or I will seek injunctive relief and fees. The kind of line that makes even the overconfident pause. And then, Mercy came disguised as a plate of cookies. She was small and silver-haired, cardigan soft, eyes that had seen more than anyone's grandmother should. Pat, she said, setting the cookies on Harold's table like we were about to discuss church schedules. Pat Donnelly, I live over on Hemlock. I thought you could use something that isn't an affidavit. Her hands trembled when she reached into her bag, not with age but with focus. She laid out photographs the way professionals lay out truths, gently but with finality. HOA budgets, bank statements, screenshots of transfers labeled safety consulting and community enhancement, moving to an entity with a sterling P.O. box. She slid a simple spreadsheet to the top, columns, dates, amounts. The total at the bottom made my throat tighten. Retired FBI, she said, as if she were talking about a long-ago teaching job. 25 years. Financial crimes. I watch. I count. And I don't like bullies who hide theft behind bylaws. I scanned the pages. Money trickled out at first, then poured, right after Bryn took the presidency, right when the compliance drives started, right when the elderly and the Brown families began to receive love letters about bird feeders and saints. She'd been stuffing envelopes with fines in one hand while the other emptied our emergency fund into something with her name on it. Pat tapped a finger on a line item labeled Fire Safety Audit. That's not a vendor, she said. It's a shell. And this, a printout of an insurance application, is falsified. Grossly inflated valuations. Omissions about prior claims. Filed weeks after she started with the fines. I looked up. She didn't flinch. You're not the end game, Pat said quietly. You're the cover. The noise. Keep the federal judge busy with chalk drawings and birdseed while she moves the money and primes the neighborhood for a very profitable tragedy. It's one thing to suspect someone is rotten. It's another to have a retired federal agent lay the rot on your table, connected with string so plain a child could follow it. She pulled another sheet from her bag, my address highlighted on architectural plans, notes in the margins about electrical panels, foundation access points, and an underlined word that made bile rise, acceleration. She pulled this from your contractor's database. Pat said, your upgrades with Harold. She knows where the lines run, where the wires hide, where a spark looks accidental. I held the plan like it might bite. She's planning an inspection fire, I said, hearing my voice from a distance. Blame it on code. Claim the spread. Claim 2 spreads, Pat corrected gently. 1 to you, 1 to her. File before the flames if she can. It's not the first time I've seen it. My house suddenly felt smaller, like the walls understood what we were saying and were trying to pull themselves inward to protect the photographs on the mantel. Fear made a brief appearance. It didn't linger. I looked at Gavel sleeping in the square of sun. He always claimed and felt something steadier rise. How long have you been watching? I asked. Since she fined Mrs. Morgan from the memorial bed, Pat said, old cop instincts never retire. I don't sleep much anymore. So I watch. And I counted 34 separate transfers from the HOA account in 6 months. I mapped the timing against her compliance notices. Every spike in harassment coincides with withdrawals. Noise in one hand, theft in the other. Silence settled in, the useful kind, the kind you get right before a verdict. I thought about the discipline commission letter, heavy with performance. I thought about the blogs that latched onto a narrative they liked more than the truth. I thought about Bryn's tape measure snapping out like a tongue, and the way she'd stared at Harold's coffee mug through my kitchen window. I thought about Gavel's ribs under my palm at the animal hospital, and the way Walt had pressed a grocery bag full of violations into my hands and apologized like he was the one who'd done something wrong. Pat slid one last page across the table. It was an email from Bryn to an insurance adjuster. Subject line, neighboring property risk. The timestamp made my scalp prickle. The language was clinical. The implication was not. She's already laying groundwork. Pat said, and you don't have a lot of time. I'm a judge. I move carefully. I don't spook. But there are moments when speed is the most ethical choice. I pulled my legal pad close and began a list. Immediate protective orders. Emergency injunction freezing HOA accounts. Formal referral to the Attorney General for civil rights violations. Spoliation notice to the management company. A call to the U.S. Attorney's Office for interstate fraud and mail fraud review. A coordination chart for victims and witnesses. So no one told their story twice or got lost in the process? Pat watched and nodded like a teacher proud of a student who finally stopped apologizing for being smart. You'll need surveillance, she said. Better than you have. Redundant storage. Angle coverage. Audio where it's legal. We'll have it, I said. She pushed the cookies toward me. Eat. Then call Sarah. Then lock everything. I didn't cry. I haven't cried much since Harold died. Grief mineralized into something too dense for tears. But I felt a pressure behind my eyes as strong as the feeling I get when a jury comes back after 3 hours with a verdict we both know is right. Relief mixed with rage in equal parts. Relief because I wasn't paranoid. Rage because the life Harold and I built was a line item in someone's spreadsheet. The ethics complaint on my table felt suddenly small, like a toy, Gavel next to the real thing. Bryn could throw paper storms all day. I knew where the fault line ran now, and I knew exactly how to drive a wedge into it until the whole structure came down. That night, I changed every lock. I posted no trespassing signs with the statutory citations underneath, because some people only understand rules when they see numbers. I filed the criminal charges I drafted and clicked send on the referrals that would wake more than one federal agent before dawn. As I turned off the kitchen light, Pat's last sentence echoed in the quiet. Your house isn't just a target. It's scheduled. Your house isn't just a target. It's scheduled. Pat didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sentence sat on my kitchen table between the cookies and the ledgers like a live wire. I'd spent days peeling back layers of petty tyranny. She lifted the whole skin off and showed me the muscle underneath. She came back the next morning with a banker's box and a look I've only seen on surgeons who know they can't sugarcoat the diagnosis. Out came documents in careful stacks, insurance applications, HOA transfers, a printout of a contractor license suspension, and then a series of photographs that made the room feel colder. Same face, different names. A California license with Rebecca Ashworth printed under Bryn's smile. A Phoenix ID calling her Beth Sterling, the last name braided neatly into a new life. A grainy copy of a Detroit intake form, Sandra McKenzie, stamped with a federal prisoner number. The hair length changed, the city skylines changed, the eyes didn't. 4 states, Pat said, tapping each photo, her finger steady. 6 identities I can confirm. Every time the same pattern. Insert into an HOA, escalate standards, bleed emergency funds into shells, and prime an insurance claim big enough to make rebuilds look generous. Then move on before anyone with a badge connects the dots. How many communities? I asked. 15 confirmed, she said. Probably more. Sacramento lost its community center to a mysterious electrical fire after 3 Hispanic families were fined into moving. Phoenix saw elderly residents hospitalized from stress during her compliance crusade. The spreadsheets are identical, same labels, same spikes, same timing. She slid a printed email next, redactions like scars across the page. Subject line, neighboring property risk profile. My address in the body. Clinical language about developing structural issues and increased fire load concerns. The timestamp landed like a punch. It predated her first violation letter to me. She laid your groundwork before she ever measured your fence. Pat said, evidence has weight when it's right. My hands felt heavier with each new sheet. We moved to insurance. Pat pointed to numbers circled in red ink. She insured her $800,000 house for $2.8 million. Inflated contents, falsified remodel history, omitted prior claims. Mail and wire fraud all over it. And this? She tapped the declarations page. She filed under a name that doesn't belong to her in any legal sense. Identity theft stacked on top. Witness protection? I asked, hearing a rumor I didn't want to be true. Pat nodded once. She testified against a Detroit fraud ring in 2012. 18 months inside. Entered the program. Disappeared in 2015. She's been stealing the cover ever since. Using the federal mask to run new crimes. The violation alone is 10 years. Add interstate fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and now your case, attempted murder if she gets what she wants. I thought of Bryn on my lawn with her tape measure like a baton timing the performance. I thought of the discipline complaint accusing me of weaponizing my robe. Weaponizing. The irony would have been funny if the plans on the table didn't include a map of my kitchen. Pat set a set of architectural drawings in front of me. I recognized the outlines immediately. Our home's footprint, the electrical upgrade Harold and I planned when Hope still sat across from me at breakfast. In the margins, someone had written notes. They weren't mine. Panel here. Old foundation seam access. Dry vegetation stack. A single word underlined twice, accelerate. She pulled this from Sterling Premium's database before the license was suspended. Pat said, your husband's upgrades gave her a blueprint for a fire that would look like a fault. She knows where a spark will read as accident on the first pass. My finger traced the pencil line toward the pantry door, the same path I walked every morning for coffee, past the mug I still couldn't wash. Grief is a blunt instrument. This was a scalpel. She'd planned to cut through my life and leave the edges clean enough to cash. She's not punishing you for that old ruling. Pat said, merciful with the truth. You're a distraction, a lightning rod. You keep eyes on the fence while she drains the fund and sets the stage. You sound sure. Pat nodded toward the ledgers. 34 transfers in 6 months. Safety consulting, landscape emergencies, community enhancement. All to a shell with a Sterling P.O. box and a different owner every quarter. The spikes line up with the harassment blitzes. Every time she turned up the heat on residents, she moved money. This isn't sloppy. It's rehearsed. Gavel thumped his tail against the chair leg, old cat patience radiating from his patch of sun. He'd started purring again at night, the sound as steady as a metronome while I drafted charges. I reached down and rested my hand on the warm curve of his back, feeling his ribs hold beneath my palm. It helped. Say the crimes out loud, I told Pat. I want to hear them in sequence. Mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, insurance fraud, embezzlement, civil rights violations if we can show discriminatory targeting, and I think we can, witness protection violations, conspiracy, and if she sets your house up the way these notes suggest, arson, attempted murder, RICO to tie it all together. Federal, I said. Without question, she said. Cross-state money, electronic transfers, insurance companies in multiple jurisdictions. But you'll want the state in too. They'll pound the HOA angle and the civil rights piece. This is one of those rare cases where everyone has a lane and they all lead to prison. I've always believed patience is a weapon when you know how to wield it. It's not the same as waiting. It's timing with intent. I pulled a legal pad toward me and began a list with a pen that felt heavier than it had yesterday. Temporary restraining order against further inspections with teeth. Emergency injunction freezing HOA accounts pending records release. Preservation notices to the association, the management company, and Sterling Premium. Formal complaint to the Attorney General, pattern-based civil rights violations. Referral to the U.S. Attorney for wire/mail fraud and identity theft. Contact CBI and Treasury financial crimes on the embezzlement and transfers. Upgrade surveillance. Redundancy, offsite storage, audio where legal. Add one more, Pat said. Bring in someone who knows how to run a RICO from the victim side. A prosecutor's brain in a civil suit body. I have a name, I said. I thought about the board meeting, the timer, the gavel she hadn't earned, the way neighbors leaned in when someone finally asked for the rules in public. I thought about Walt's decades of porch conversations and how he'd turned them into an intelligence network before I even realized that's what it was. I thought about the Rodriguez family, the teacher, the nurse, the veteran. I thought about the way a neighborhood can forget its own strength until someone gives it back its name. Whatever you do, Pat said, do it now. If she thinks the window is closing, she'll rush the fire. They always rush the fire. I stood and felt the old house hold me, as if the beams understood the gravity of the moment. Harold used to say our home was stubborn, it had outlasted fashions and storms and 100 families' temporary dramas, It would not outlast a woman with accelerant and a spreadsheet. I opened a drawer and pulled out a card I'd never had to use. Top line, U.S. Attorney's Office, Interstate Fraud. Second line, Treasury, Financial Crimes Liaison. Third line, written in my own hand years ago after a seminar about complex prosecutions. Rebecca Morgan, former Fed, now on the right side of white-collar wars. The calls were short and unambiguous. I didn't sell drama. I offered facts, timestamps, and the promise of evidence they could build a career on. Then I emailed Sarah Morgan with a single sentence, "Buckle up. The HOA story just went federal." Before dawn, replies stacked in my inbox with words that electrify prosecutors: jurisdiction, task force, preservation, warrants. I walked the fence herald and I built, palm on cedar that smelled like rain and sawdust, and made a quiet promise I wish I could have said to his face. I couldn't save our first house, but I could make sure the person who tried to turn it into a bank withdrawal learned what justice felt like when it was personal, precise, and permanent. By nightfall, my kitchen would stop being a kitchen. It would become a war room. And the people who'd been bullied in the shadows would have a table to sit at and a map to follow. Tomorrow, we wouldn't just hold the line. We'd take the field. By nightfall, my kitchen didn't look like a kitchen. The coffee maker had to share counter space with color-coded binders, label makers, and a laser printer that hummed like a hive. The air smelled like coffee, toner, and a particular kind of urgency that lives in rooms where people have decided the last good option is to fight well. Pat arrived with a banker's box and a retired Fed stillness that made everyone else sharper. Walt came with a pocket notebook fattened by 60 years of conversations on porches and sidewalks. And Rebecca Morgan swept in from Denver like purpose in a black suit, former federal prosecutor, now the kind of white-collar litigator who smiles only when a case is airtight. I'd asked for a prosecutor's brain in a civil suit body. I got a guided missile. We didn't have speeches. We had a plan. We split the fight into 3 coordinated fronts and built a machine around it. Federal first. Mail and wire fraud for the transfers. Identity theft and witness protection violations for the names she stole. Insurance fraud for the inflated policies. RICO to braid it all together. We put boxes next to each charge and started filling them with proof, timestamps, ledger entries, screenshots, the shell company trail that never expected anyone to follow it. We looped in the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI task force that loves nothing more than a cross-state money case with clean victims. Treasury's financial crimes team joined because numbers don't lie when you line them up. Every call ended with the same sentence: preserve everything. State next. Colorado Bureau of Investigation on the embezzlement, the Attorney General's Civil Rights Unit on the discriminatory enforcement patterns, elderly residents and minority families fined into fear while board-friend properties bloomed with unbothered violations. The DA's Office for Trespass, Evidence Fabrication, Animal Cruelty, and whatever else we could pin to the day, she put her face to my kitchen window and smiled at Harold's mug. Civil rights last, but not least. The pattern wasn't just mean, it was illegal. We drafted a complaint that didn't bluster. It laid out a clean, ugly timeline. Who was targeted, how much they paid, what they removed under duress when they moved away. We named the protected classes Bryn had turned into targets and attached the receipts. Then we froze the money. Rebecca filed for an emergency injunction to lock down HOA accounts pending a records review. We didn't argue about whether Bryn would comply. We assumed she wouldn't and wrote for a judge who's seen that movie and hated the ending. At the same time, I sent a statutory records demand as an owner, 5 years of minutes, adopted rules, all fine ledgers, vendor contracts, and every payment authorization. State law gives owners the right to inspect. She could stall, but the deadline had a court date at the end of it. We treated evidence like a newborn. Chain of custody logs lived next to the stand, mixer. We scanned everything twice and stored it 3 ways: secure drive, encrypted cloud, and an off-site thumb drive Pat kept like a relic. Spoliation notices went out by certified mail to the association, the management company that existed mostly in Bryn's email signature and sterling premium. Destroy documents now, go to prison later. Walt, who'd never called himself anything but a neighbor, became our intelligence chief. He turned decades of porch small talk into a map, who'd been fined for which streets attracted compliance drives, where Bryn parked when she inspected, which vendors came and went with clipboards and little interest in the law. He built a contact tree that belonged in an emergency operations center. If someone knocked on an elderly resident's door after dark, 3 people knew by the time the knocker reached the sidewalk. People started to show up because fighting well is contagious. A nurse in scrubs brought a thermos and the violation letters she'd saved out of stubbornness. A teacher arrived with a shoebox of notes and a list of dates she'd watched Bryn walk into her backyard while she was at church. The Rodriguez family returned from Phoenix with more than grief. They brought 17 witnesses and a timeline that connected Pinewood's standards to a pattern that had repeated in 3 cities. Security became strategy. Pat rebuilt my system like a professional. Cameras multiplied and grew smarter. Angles overlapped. Audio recorders went where they were legal. Storage became redundant and then redundant again. She calibrated frames for prosecutors, cross streets visible, house numbers legible, time stamps burned into the corner like a quiet oath. The fireproof DVR enclosure got bolted down so hard you'd need a team of arsonists and a miracle to break it. We planned for the worst because cornered criminals don't learn empathy, they learn speed. Protective surveillance went up around vulnerable homes. The elderly single parents, families Bryn had already marked. We created safe call protocols and a plain language code word system for neighbors who didn't want their phones to light up with lawyer. We arranged for overnight light sweeps and doorbell checks. Rebecca reminded us that the last stretch before an indictment is where people get desperate. Every fresh thing Bryn did became evidence against her. That was the beautiful part. She couldn't help herself. The letters kept coming. More fines, bigger threats, invented policies. Each one dropped into a clear sleeve and logged with the kind of detail that makes defense attorneys quiet down. Transfers kept moving from the HOA to the shell, oblivious to the injections of sunlight we'd just planned. We pressed the insurance angle because money closes more doors than moralizing ever will. Insurers don't like fraud not because it's wrong, but because it's expensive. We flagged discrepancies and opened the line into the special investigations units who carry clipboards and ruin schemes for a living. Fraud triggers audits. Audits trigger notifications to mortgage holders. Mortgage holders trigger consequences no HOA president can outpose. We didn't need to win arguments about aesthetics. We needed to pull levers that made banks pay attention. Sarah worked in parallel, not as a crusader, but as a journalist who understands that sunlight has a sound. She verified sources, mapped the pattern across states with Pat's evidence, and prepared a follow-up that didn't center me. It centered the people who'd been forced to rip out the pieces of their lives that made their houses feel like home. When her story aired, it would not be a rant. It would be a mirror. By mid-afternoon, my fridge wore a grid of court dates, deadlines, and contact trees. 3 agencies had confirmed jurisdiction. The injunction hearing was slotted for first thing in the morning, and the judge assigned had a reputation for hating cute paperwork tricks. The AG's office sent a single line that made my chest loosen. Received, tracking, expect contact. Gavel supervised the command center from the sunspot on the table, old cat eyes half closed, purr like a low drum under the buzz of printers. He'd claimed Harold's chair out of habit. I let him keep it. Every time he stretched his paws into the binder spines, I remembered what this was about. Not fences, not fines, not even my reputation. Safety, dignity, the right to live without being hunted in your own home. We anticipated Bryn's next move the way you anticipate an oncoming storm by the pressure in your bones. If she believed the window was closing, and it was, she'd accelerate the fire. It's what Pat had warned me. They always rush the fire. So we set the table for that too. We prepped a direct line to the fire marshal's office and the arson unit. We flagged my address in dispatch. We drafted a restraining order tailored to inspections with teeth for anyone who stepped onto my property under fake authority. We placed a call to one particular investigator who has seen more accidental blazes than anyone in the state and knows exactly where accelerant spills when egos do. By midnight, the machine was built. My kitchen was quiet except for the hum of external hard drives and the kind of silence that comes before an orchestra plays. Everyone went home to sleep the way people sleep the night before surgery, lightly ready to move when the pager barks. I stood at the back door with my palm on cedar still new enough to smell like a sawmill and made one last check. Cameras red-eyed and alert. Locks changed. Signs posted with statutes printed below, in fonts even the overconfident respect. The neighborhood breathed in the high plains dark, unaware of how close we were to becoming a headline. I didn't pray. I planned. Then I waited, because patience with purpose is not passivity. It's a fuse you control. When the trucks came and the tape measures turned into torches, they would find a house wired not just for electricity and memory, but for evidence. And when Bryn tried to turn concern into a costume on camera, there would be more lenses than hers watching. They didn't come in a rush. They came like a crew that had done this before. At 2:47 p.m., 2 unmarked trucks rolled to a stop like they were early for a delivery. Men in coveralls climbed out with the careful efficiency of people who treat crime like a trade. My cameras caught all of it, faces, plates, the way they glanced once and never again at the lenses they didn't think could see them. I watched on my phone as they choreographed the work. One traced a path along the foundation with a sprayer that left no color and all the intent. Another unpacked flexible gas lines, unmarked joints, fittings that never passed through a permit desk. They nestled connections near electrical panels where a spark would read as negligence, not murder. Dead brush, baled and dry, appeared where no wind had put it, stacked in patterns that only fire behaviorists and arsonists know how to read. It was clinical. It was practiced. It was recorded in 1080p with time stamps a prosecutor could frame. I didn't call them landscapers in my head. Landscapers care about growth. The phone tree we'd built went live without a shout. Walt shifted from his porch to a vantage point 2 doors down, camera ready. Mrs. Rodriguez texted plate numbers before the crew even finished backing in. Our postal carrier, who'd been looped in with quiet clarity, strolled past with a stack of mail and a phone held low, capturing what looked like routine deliveries and would become anything but. Pat pinged our contacts at the fire marshal's office from my kitchen while the printer spit a final stack of preservation notices. Bryn understood optics, so she arrived with a camera. She stepped onto my sidewalk 20 minutes later with Channel 7 in tow, all concern and contour. Community safety on her lips, anonymous tips in her hand. A performance pitch to people who like rules because rules make them feel protected. She gestured at the planted hazards with the moral outrage of someone who hadn't paid to install them. The irony would have been funny if accelerant weren't wicking into my soil. Sarah Morgan didn't play along. She filmed everything, as she should, but she listened more than she spoke. The lens doesn't care how good your athleisure looks. It cares if what you're saying matches what the world can see. We'd flagged my address with the fire department days earlier. When the call came in requesting a safety inspection, it didn't sit in a queue. Fire Marshal Jake Morrison pulled up with a clipboard and the tired, exacting eye of a man who has spent 30 years reading what flames try to say after the fact. He didn't need flames to hear this story. He crouched and touched 2 fingers to soil that looked normal and wasn't. He traced a finger along the base of the siding where the sprayer had hesitated. He followed the gas line like it was a sentence and read out loud in that quiet way seasoned investigators do, not to the cameras, but to the record. In another life, he could have been a judge. He didn't condemn the house. He didn't write the script Bryn needed. He called it what it was. Preparation. What happened next was inevitable if you understand greed the way cops do. She tried to move the needle with currency. A folded envelope glided like a stage whisper across a clipboard. Words about efficiency and documentation and community safety strung together the way people build bridges out of air when they think power is for sale. His body camera caught all of it. The offer, the language, her practice tilt towards secrecy. The moment he told her bribing a public official is a crime. The half-second where she realized she was starring in evidence, not a news segment. There is a shift you can feel when a scheme turns into a case. Phones ping differently. Agents use verbs that are more muscular. By late afternoon, the fire marshal's report had reached the arson unit, who had already watched my feeds. The DA's office looped in the police for immediate site security. The U.S. Attorney's Office replied to my referral with a sentence that felt like a detonation. Warrants in process. We didn't stop at my foundation. The neighborhood netweed cast started to hum. 2 blocks over, a widow's side yard featured an identical stack of dead brush that hadn't been there at breakfast. A cul-de-sac away, a family with a wheelchair ramp found gas fittings coiled beside their meter, like snakes that hadn't yet decided whether to strike. Pat's map turned from theory to triage. We documented, we escorted residents into safer spaces, and we watched as a pattern metastasized into a federal exhibit. Insurance investigators don't wear badges, but they can smell fraud faster than anyone with one. We fed what we had to the Special Investigations Unit with jurisdiction over Brin's policy. They pulled threads we couldn't see from our side, valuation spikes, staged correspondence, a timeline that started before she ever introduced herself to me as the widow. Mortgage holders were notified. The quiet kind of panic that lives in banks began to do our work for us. Rebecca filed our emergency injunction to freeze HOA accounts with a surgical brief that gave the judge nothing to deny. No rhetoric, just violations, dates, withdrawals, and a ledger that bled when you held it up to light. The order hit before the close of business with a clerk's stamp and language that made noncompliance a fast track to handcuffs. Through it all, my phone fed me a live view of men in coveralls trying to turn my home into Tinder. They placed debris, like chess pieces. They arranged hoses in ways that would look like late repairs and not prepositioned ignition. I swallowed the urge to kick them off my lawn through a screen. Better to let the camera watch. Better to let the line spool out until every hand on it belonged to someone who thought they were safe from consequences. Neighbors who once ducked behind curtains walked their dogs at brave angles and pretended not to notice how often they pointed their phones at faces. There is something holy about a community deciding out loud that it will not be preyed upon again. It looks like teenagers on bikes riding slow circles with eyes open. It looks like a retired teacher taking notes with the same neat cursive she used to teach second graders. But this time the lesson is for a jury. I did what I always do when anger tries to outrun judgment. I sat and wrote criminal complaints for bribery, supplements to the trespass and animal cruelty charges, a memorandum for the AG's office connecting the chronology of harassments to the timing of transfers, a clean memo to the U.S. Attorney summarizing new facts, accelerant patterns, unpermitted gas lines, on-camera bribery, evidence of staging at multiple residences, media manipulation attempts. Every paragraph, more oxygen to a fire of a different kind. By early evening, the trucks left like they had come, unmarked and confident. The planted paths remained. The gas sat coiled, waiting for a spark that would read as electrical fatigue. Bryn lingered on the sidewalk for the cameras, long enough to sell concern and try to buy time. She didn't know time had already switched sides. Warrants don't always come with sirens. Sometimes they arrive quietly in a judge's folder, docketed with a number that signals the start of the end. By nightfall, the first round was signed. Phones, accounts, emails, the shell company's paper guts. Bank holds ticked over right as auto payments tried to slip money into the dark. The management company, which had existed mostly as a signature line, found itself obligated by law to produce records it had never expected anyone to ask for. We didn't sleep in our houses that night. Not because we were afraid of paper threats, we'd outgrown those. Because accelerant does what accelerant does when matches find it. I packed a bag with what mattered and handed my keys to Walt, who treated them like evidence because that's what they were. He sat on his porch with a thermos and a radio and the stubborn posture of a man who refuses to let his street become someone else's profit. Gavel curled into the crook of my arm at Walt's, heavier than his 14 years. The house smelled like old books and pipe tobacco and the safety of decades. I kept one ear tuned to the quiet hum of my phone as offsite storage pinged every few minutes to confirm it was still receiving a flood of small truths. Justice has a sound when it's gathering. So does catastrophe. You learn to hear the difference. The neighborhood held its breath under a sky that pretended to be ordinary. The accelerant already knew its job. The lines were laid. The cameras were live. The warrants were signed. The only thing missing was ignition. At 3:17 a.m., the night would decide what kind of story we were telling next. The blast at 3:17 a.m. shook Walt's windows and snapped me awake into a world I already understood too well. I crossed his living room in Harold's robe and saw my house turn the night into a mock sunrise, orange, roaring, ravenous. 28 years of breakfasts and arguments and quiet forgiveness went bright and loud all at once. The cedar fence glowed and then surrendered. The roses Harold coaxed from stubborn soil hissed and folded into heat. Sirens came like a covenant. We'd flagged my address days ago. The engines landed fast, crisp, purposeful. I stood on Walt's porch with a thermos I didn't drink, breathing smoke that smelled like burnt wires and old paper. It didn't smell like accident. It smelled like intent. The fire didn't get to devour everything it wanted. The fireproof vault Pat had bolted into my utility room did its job. When the flames finally retreated under a sheet of foam and discipline, the arson unit slid the box from ash and carried out a spine of truth. Camera footage, redundant drives, time stamps burned into corners like vows. We plugged one into a van with cold air and colder eyes and watched the last hours unspool in evidence-grade clarity. Sterling Premium's crew entered at 2:45 a.m. The same faces my daytime cameras had loved, the same gait, the same casual efficiency. At 3:10, her husband appeared with equipment that belonged in a training video for how not to die in a house fire. The accelerant trails we'd watched them lay that afternoon now licked to life in infrared. It was choreography for a payout. Marcus Webb, the state's lead arson investigator, said little and missed nothing. He traced accelerant highways with a gloved finger. He followed the illegal gas lines like a sentence to its period. Thermal imaging built a map of the fire's mind, how it had wanted to move, where it was fed, why it had grown so fast. He looked at me only once. Not pity. Confirmation. This wasn't failure, he said. This was design. Truth attracts more truth when it stops hiding. Jennifer Park from the insurer's Special Investigations Unit walked up with a laptop and a look that said she'd been waiting to be asked the right question. She had pulled the claim file in response to our fraud tip earlier in the week. There, neat and stunning, sat a preliminary submission from Bryn for anticipated spread damage from neighboring property. Timestamp, 2:30 a.m. 47 minutes before ignition. She filed for her loss before you had won, Jennifer said, scrolling, her voice flat with professional disgust. That's not prediction. That's participation. Neighbors gathered as dawn drained the fire's color back into smoke. People came with blankets and coffee, and faces that stopped pretending this was normal. Mrs. Rodriguez took my hands the way mothers do when they need to borrow strength and lend it at the same time. Walt stood at my shoulder like a guardrail. Teenagers who'd spent the summer filming skate tricks now filmed the quiet choreography of investigators flagging evidence. Nobody hid anymore. Bryn came, because of course she did. Designer, athleisure, hair immaculate, a somber expression manufactured for morning television. She stood within 50 feet of the ruin and spoke phrases crafted for sound bites about community safety and the tragic consequences of ignoring necessary inspections. She said my name as if it were a problem she'd tried to solve, and I wouldn't let her. The cameras rolled. So, did the FBI agents handheld across the street, because we had asked them to be ready for that too. She didn't know what we knew. She didn't know that Morrison's body cam already held her bribery attempt in digital amber. She didn't know that bank holds had frozen the HOA's bleeding accounts an hour earlier. She didn't know that warrants had been signed on the strength of accelerant trails and backdated policies, and a ledger that looked like a confession. She didn't know that while she posed, someone at Treasury had flagged a transfer that tried to run at 4:12 a.m. and hit a wall labeled forfeiture. By mid-morning, the crime scene breathed under tarps and tape, and the case moved like weather. CBI confirmed the shell company in Bryn's orbit had been paid with HOA funds labeled Fire Safety Audit. Phone records placed 2 of the men from my footage within a pocket of the network that hires Arson the way corporations hire consultants. The U.S. Attorney's Office sent one text that felt like a verdict: execute. Dawn raids don't look like the movies unless you're the one standing in your driveway watching. They look like quiet organization and loud consequence. Federal marshals took Bryn's husband in a neat stack of movements that left no space for argument. Agents rolled up the crew with the same lack of drama they use for accountants who forgot to be honest. The warrant at Bryn's door went down as the sun cleared the roof lines, with a formality she had never granted anyone she'd targeted. I didn't cheer. There's dignity in watching a system do the job it was built to do. Rebecca texted me a simple therein, followed by a list of charges that stacked like bricks. Arson, attempted murder, wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, bribery of a public official, witness protection violations, and RICO. Bank accounts froze under the same statute we use to shut down gangs. Sterling Premium, already suspended, became an organ donor for restitution. The irony didn't miss me. Harold used to joke that white-collar criminals don't understand RICO because they can't imagine being grouped with people who use violence. Today erased that distinction. She had used money and fire as 2 sides of the same idea. I spent the afternoon in Walt's kitchen while my own cooled into a skeleton. Agents rotated through our war room to copy what they needed, careful with chain of custody, grateful the way professionals are when citizens do their job for them without grandstanding. Pat briefed a team from Treasury on the timing of transfers against spikes in harassment. Walt poured coffee like a chaplain. Gavel slept as if the worst had finally taken a breath, and he could too. The shock of loss came in odd edges. A charred fork lay on a recovery tarp, and I knew which drawer it had lived in for 20 years. The window where Harold had watched first snow each winter hung in empty space. The pantry door from the plans Pat showed me was now a rectangle of cool air. Grief and relief turned out to be neighbors. I didn't send either away. By evening, the story had migrated from one address to an indictment. Sarah's piece cut together testimony and time stamps with a grace that kept people human and made the pattern undeniable. The comments weren't a mob anymore, they were a chorus. Other neighborhoods started emailing tip lines. A state senator called the AG's office asking for a briefing on HOA reform. The Rodriguez teenager posted a TikTok that taught more people about selective enforcement in 60 seconds than a semester of policy ever could. I walked the edge of what had been my yard under a sky that had the nerve to be beautiful, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Harold's diagnosis turned our calendar into a countdown. Not joy, not even satisfaction. Relief that the worst part, the part where you know what's coming and can't stop it, was over. The damage was done. The record was clear. The consequence had a schedule now, not just a promise. I ran my palm over a chunk of cedar that had survived, charred on one side, fragrant on the other. Cedar is stubborn. It remembers what it was before the fire. So do people. Across the street, a marshal's SUV idled. Inside, Bryn stared straight ahead, hands cuffed, the posture of someone who has finally met a rule she can't bend with charm or threat. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. Next week, she would walk into a courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and call the process unfair. She'd be right about one thing. It wasn't fair. It was better than fair. It was just I went back inside Walt's house, sat at his table, and started drafting victim impact statements while Pat set out plates for whoever was coming through next. The smoke still clung to my hair, threaded with the last scent of my home. It didn't smell like destruction anymore. It smelled like a case that could finally stand up on its own legs and walk into court. And a week later, it did. 7 days after the fire, she came back into my life wearing orange instead of athleisure. Federal custody doesn't flatter anyone, but it stripped Bryn of her favorite accessory, control. The gallery was standing room only. Agents, investigators, insurance specialists, and neighbors who had learned one another's names in the worst possible way filled the benches. The state attorney general slid into the front row with a legal pad. Outside, overflow crowds watched a live stream on the courthouse steps. I had recused, of course. My colleague, Judge Patricia Morrison, took the bench with a gravity that made the room sit straighter. They read the names first: Bethany Sterling, Rebecca Ashworth, Sandra McKenzie. 6 identities in 4 states, all sharing one face. Each alias fell like a gavel strike. Then came the charges, stacked with clinical precision. Attempted murder of a federal judge, first-degree arson, mail and wire fraud, identity theft, witness protection violations, conspiracy, bribery of a public official, RICO, and a civil rights count that laid bare the pattern of targeting elderly and minority residents. The clerk needed to breathe halfway through. Her attorney asked for bond. He had to, it was his job. Community ties he offered. No flight risk, he said. Meanwhile, the community she had built was a network of shell companies, and the only ties she honored were zip ties on other people's rights. Federal prosecutor Amanda Stevens stood with a folder that could have sealed a vault. She spoke the way professionals do when the facts are a storm. Calmly, with inevitability. 6 false identities. 15 communities harmed. Vermilion siphoned. A judge's house prepared to burn while claims were filed before the first flame. The gallery murmured. Walt folded his arms. Mrs. Rodriguez pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and didn't let go of her husband's hand. Then Bryn did the one thing she's always done when cornered. She tried to turn the room into a mirror and make the rest of us look like her. She asked to be heard, and Judge Morrison, careful and fair, allowed it within limits. Bryn pivoted toward me even though I wasn't on the bench, chin up, tone steady. She accused me of weaponizing the courts. She called the investigation political. She said the HOA had only sought safety and that I had used my robe to destroy a citizen exercising legitimate authority. Silence can be louder than outrage. It was so quiet I could hear the wheeze of the air vents. Morrison waited, let the performance end where it wanted to end, and then answered in a voice like a well-made bridge, strong, measured, designed to bear weight. Miss McKenzie, she said, you stand accused on evidence that includes time-stamped video of your crew staging an arson, an on-camera bribery attempt of a fire marshal, financial records that chart embezzlement in lockstep with harassment, and an insurance claim time-stamped 47 minutes before ignition. You did not police a neighborhood. You engineered harm under color of authority. Bond was denied with language that could have been etched in granite. Flight risk. Danger to the community. Remand to federal custody. The applause that followed wasn't decorum, but it was human. The marshals didn't stop it. Sometimes a community needs to hear itself say yes to justice. She glanced at me as they let her out. Hatred can have wattage. It didn't warm the air. It didn't change the record. What mattered was already in evidence, and what comes next in a courtroom isn't catharsis, it's process. Trials don't sprint, they pace. But this one moved like weather. Federal juries don't always return quickly. Ours did in 3 hours and 47 minutes, which meant they paused for lunch and then finished agreeing. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing that followed spread its weight precisely. Life without parole for Bryn on the combination of attempted murder of a federal judge, arson, and the stacked federal fraud and RICO counts. 25 years for her husband on conspiracy and fraud. Sterling premium dissolved into restitution, its assets liquidated under the same statute used to dismantle criminal enterprises that think violence is someone else's lane. We didn't measure victory in years alone. We measured it in repairs. The court-appointed receiver distributed $3.2 million in seized assets to victims across 4 states, the largest HOA fraud restitution anyone in the room could remember. Pinewood's families received compensation and punitive damages that did more than write checks. They wrote precedent. Other neighborhoods now quote those cases when they say no. Pinewood remade itself. Walt Henderson, who has always been the sort of leader who doesn't introduce himself as one, was elected HOA president unanimously. He doesn't wield a gavel. He holds meetings at the community garden. Our bylaws learned humility. Fines over $50 require community approval. Monthly financials are posted where anyone can read them in daylight. Hearings are real, not theater. Mediation is mandatory before lawyers enter the chat. Targeting anyone for age, ethnicity, disability, or economic status isn't just prohibited. It's an automatic removal offense with no room for cute interpretations. The ripples didn't stop at our fence line. The Pinewood Protection Act passed with bipartisan votes after legislators held our evidence up to the light. It requires HOA financial transparency, limits fine authority, mandates due process, and triggers state oversight when complaint patterns turn into a map. 15 states borrowed our blueprint. Bankers, not known for sentiment, rewrote guidelines to require fraud reporting on suspicious HOA financials. Insurers adjusted their audits. It turns out sunlight is contagious when people decide to open their blinds. We built more than laws. We built memory on purpose. The Judge Harold Blackwood Memorial Scholarship started as a wish and turned into a promise. Donations from grateful communities, book rights, and a documentary deal grew it to $750,000 and counting. Maria Rodriguez, who watched her parents pack a statue of the Virgin into a box because a bully in a yoga jacket said it didn't fit the aesthetic, became this year's recipient. She heads to Harvard Law with a file of notes and a fire we didn't have to stage. Every fall, we host the Pinewood Justice Festival. It isn't a party to mock a defeat. It's a celebration of what happens when people get loud for each other instead of at each other. Walt's Bluegrass Band plays the kind of music that makes even city kids clap on 2 and 4. Vendors donate a portion of their proceeds to legal defense funds for neighborhoods still fighting. Pat runs packed workshops on spotting financial crime patterns, how to read a ledger, how to ask for records without sounding like a threat, how to become the kind of neighbor who notices before harm scales. Our Community Resource Center mails kits to HOAs across the country. Templates for records requests, checklists for due process, guides to recognizing selective enforcement. 41 copycat fraudsters were arrested in the first year after we went public because people learned the rhythm of the scam and chose to clap offbeat. Professionally, my life got louder. The American Bar Association created an award I didn't ask for and named it after me. Recognition for judges who keep ethics steady under pressure and defend civil rights when a mob decides due process is inconvenient. Law schools invite me to talk about how to be both firm and humane, how to keep the robe from becoming either armor or a weapon. The national applause is nice. It isn't the point. The point is home. Gavel recovered fully as cats do, with indignation and naps that look like meditation. He rules the rebuilt kitchen from a sun-warm chair. The memorial garden blooms with Harold's roses richer than before, as if the soil decided resilience is a fertilizer. Our fence still stands 6 feet of honest-cedar. It does what fences should do. It defines without dividing. On summer evenings, golden light drifts across a street that sounds different now. There is less whispering and more laughter. Kids chalk hopscotch squares without a fine attached. Mrs. Morgan's memorial bed is a place where neighbors leave notes and a stole of knitted prayer for anyone who needs it. Pat tends a victory garden next door, and Walt teaches neighborhood kids harmonica on his porch with the patience of someone who has decided to spend the rest of his years making good noise. If you're living inside a petty tyranny with a tape measure and a letterhead, hear me. Document everything. Photograph from the same place at the same time with a date stamped into the corner. Learn your statutes. Ask for records with your name and today's date At the top, organize a text tree and use it to check on each other as if you're what matters, because you are. Bullies thrive on isolation and shame. They wilt under company and light. You don't have to be a judge to use the law. You have to be a neighbor who refuses to apologize for wanting peace. I used to think justice was a verdict and a sentence. It is also a garden replanted. It is a fence rebuilt. It is a community that remembers how to sit on porches and say each other's names with respect. It is a scholarship letter that calls a teenager Dear Ms. instead of violation. It is a cat purring on a sunlit chair in a house that knows the difference between privacy and secrecy. If you stayed with me to the end of the story, you already understand that justice, when it's done right, is useful. It protects. It repairs. It teaches. And sometimes, because the universe has a sense of balance, it is also satisfying. Video outro. Thank you for being here. If this story helped you see your own neighborhood more clearly, tap like so it travels to someone who needs it. Drop a comment with your HOA wins, losses, and lessons. Your details might be another family's lifeline. Subscribe if you want more true HOA showdowns told by someone who believes in receipts and results. Next week, we're taking apart a tax assessor's side hustle that tried to steal an entire neighborhood with inflated valuations and quiet evictions. The reversal was surgical. The federal charges were beautiful. We build safer streets when we build them together. See you in the next one.